GM Growth Fam, time for another episode. And I think today I have been looking forward to this episode for a really long time. I got connected to Matt like 2 years ago, and I always knew that if I ever do a podcast, I would love to have Matt Sorg on. He obviously is the VP of Technology at Solana Foundation and somebody that I would consider a game-changing visionary in the space. I know those are like those are huge words, but I truly believe that because I've seen and followed Matt for several years now, and I know it's just fascinating to pick his brain. So Matt, thank you so much for being here.
That is quite the intro. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Matt, I know you've been a co-founder of a few startups. You started your would it be fair to say you started your career at Riot Games?
Yeah, it was my first like big kid job.
I wanted to know, especially because you mentioned to me that you were really heavy into gaming, so on and so forth. If you would not have gone down the path that you've gone down on currently, what else would you be? Would you be like a professional esports player?
That's funny. I know actually, well, my career itself has taken a lot of different avenues. So I was in like AI. I think the obvious place I would just be is still in AI. But I mean, if I just did a totally different career path, there was actually a time where I was thinking about being a football coach. I played football in college, and a lot of my friends have since become coaches at various levels.
That's quite the
American football.
almost like
Yeah, very, very different.
That's awesome. And just, sticking to the Riot Games angle, you started early in gaming, you built a few startups, and I think that the gaming consumer centric mindset almost stayed with you up until now. I really wanted to know, like, what was it about Solana that was like almost like an aha moment for you, which convinced you, like, yeah, the fundamentals look great. This is the chain that I want to be associated with. And, especially from a consumer ready perspective, this is what I want to scale forward.
Yeah, consumer ready is really the word I'd use. I moved on to an advisor of my second startup. It's a hearing aid startup. It has nothing to do with uh, blockchain. But over the next year, I kind of looked into four different ideas, and the last one was actually a blockchain idea. And I was looking around where I would potentially build it. My first startup was in blockchain on Ethereum. I just came to the conclusion that blockchains just weren't ready for consumer adoption quite yet because we had a successful, CAC and like customer acquisition funnels, but then the actual infrastructure, whenever we would have a successful launch, we would run into cost issues. We were just producing game box sales, like $20 to $60. So it just didn't really make sense to be on expensive infra when you're doing that. Yeah. So then when I had this new idea, it was like a kind of a similar low cost, low margin business. So yeah, when I was looking around, I looked at all the chains at the time, and Solana was just so clearly ready for consumer adoption. And also, I really think the way that it is prepped to scale, like it's very clear that Solana wasn't then and still isn't done. And there's still so much room to grow. And it's just basically like the most efficient spec that you can get. So it was kind of like those two things. Like this is the place for consumer adoption, and it's not close to being done. Well, why don't I just help that directly as opposed to this idea, which was a good idea, but I just thought there was more opportunity at the development level.
No, 100%. It's also because you've been with Solana for a while, you've almost seen the ups and downs and the way, like organically almost, because fundamentally, I think Solana was one of the early, or maybe I'd say go on a limb and say it was the only like very consumer focused blockchain, especially in the earlier days. I wanted to know from when and Solana in its ecosystem has had a lot of startups that have done really, really well. And I know, you're focusing on taking that forward. I wanted to know, especially when it comes to product market fit, you almost have like Solana has it, and I know you've spoken about it, like a pragmatic approach of iterating and finding what sticks and really nailing that down. What is it in especially the ecosystem DNA that Solana's been able to do really well that maybe let's say a lot of other chains have struggled with?
I think it really is a lot of other ecosystems seem to be leading from this original ethos of kind of self-sovereignty, and it kind of just turns into some sort of like religious thing where you're required to believe in some principles in order to want to use a product over another because because the product itself just isn't that much better. It doesn't actually use the fundamental principles of blockchain properties of blockchain to create a better product. It just uses those principles as like, oh yeah, do it here, as opposed to the centralized entity. And then like, and those things are very real. So I understand why they think that thing. But in the worst case, obviously centralized entities and stuff can do really bad things. But Solana, I think ecosystem and protocol have shown that there are just products that can be made better if you have this. I mean, the easiest one to talk about is kind of the network effects. You have composability across things. You can launch a coin here and then trade it on here, and it's all permissionless. None of these things have to interact with each other. So you have this like depth of ecosystem of collaborators kind of mixing together and all in one place, and that makes a great user experience because I don't have to appeal to like one vertical stack and all the things that they make. I have tons of entrepreneurs that are all trying to serve me an experience that I want. I think so. It's very practical. It's like this is a better formulation for some types of products to emerge, or than the monolithic centralized alternatives. And I think, which is funny, like I say monolithic in the sense that like a Fidelity or even like a Facebook or any financial or social app tends to be this like singular app. Solana's architecture is monolithic, but it does so in a way that prevents fragmentation and allows for a diverse set of apps to have network effects.
I know, especially because we're talking about the infrastructure of it. I know you've spoken about how the storage of meme coins in the Solana ecosystem served like a stress test for you guys to figure out, how things are working out for you. I wanted to ask you, like, if let's say in a perfect world where Solana ends up becoming the de facto, almost like invisible blockchain behind the next, let's say, $1 billion startup that comes out. And I think a lot of other people think that as well. I wanted to know, like, there, especially from a founder's perspective, is looking to build a startup of that scale. What is it that you talk about when you're sitting with those development teams? Like, hey, here are the pros and cons. This is why Solana makes sense for you as a solution, and this is why this association, especially when you have that perspective in mind, because and why I'm asking that question is because a lot of the discussion now has become like, okay, blockchain needs to go behind the scenes, and consumer ready applications and solutions and products are what needs to take up. What are those discussion points? I'm really curious to know, like, how do you talk to them? How do you walk them through that? What are the specifics? Obviously, everybody understands the tech, but I want to know, like, when you're talking to a developer, how do you see that idea in their head that, like, hey, if you end up becoming $1 billion company, we're the ones that are going to be the best solution for you.
I'm trying to figure out how to take that. I mean, it really depends on understanding the perspective of that application. There's some ways in which Solana is just 10 to 1000x better than incumbents. And this isn't a Web3 thing. This is just incumbents in general. So payment rails is like the most obvious one. Really, our especially international payment rails are super archaic. And it's really hard to operate a business internationally without paying the payments providers or other parts of the infra a ton of money. And then the settlement times are also really, really, really slow. And I think at the speed of like kind of the next generation businesses, that settlement time is a huge tax. Just the opportunity cost of that value transfer during that time. I think about like a lot of the, especially digital things, either data or compute or, inference, all these energy, even you want to be able to buy and sell and trade and do all these things very, very, very quickly. I mean, eventually with the machine to machine economy, it'll probably all be automated. But even today, waiting, T+4 is a really long time for many applications. So, I mean, I think there's that base understanding with companies that if these next gen businesses that they just benefit from blockchain rails. It's not like again, it's not some sort of religious based thing, or you don't want to be protected against AWS or whatever cloud solution. It's really not about that. It is like these are just better rails for value transfer and value creation. The other side of that is I think that the Bitcoin, basically, there was no way for humans to own digital assets. We had some rights over IP and stuff, and then there's people who broke, but there's really no way for you to own anything digital outright. But Bitcoin is basically one of the first digital things that people actually own and can operate and control themselves. And I think so to businesses that either make use of that kind of like digital open ownership property, and you have to give up some control to your users. Obviously, you're making something digital, just like you would if you're making furniture. You give that table or whatever over to somebody who buys it, you no longer control it. It's like the same thing in this new digital world where you can create digital things that you no longer own, but you can kind of describe the properties in which that business can run in code. And then also the value transfer. That's just way more efficient. So I think from that base, there's a lot of other little things you can kind of talk about, but most businesses, I think they're really going to pop off, take advantage of those two things. You mentioned meme coin. There's this saying I like to say is that Solana didn't choose meme coins. Coins chose Solana. And this isn't to disparage meme coins. This is no statement on that industry. It's just asset creation and value transfer and pricing and stuff on those. It's just a great place to operate that business. I think as different types of businesses get more comfortable operating on Solana, they'll make use of those same properties. People will mint their token that represents their profit sharing or ownership model or assets under management of an investment firm. I think more and more of these things are moving on to Solana just because it's the most efficient way of doing it.
If I can put you on the spot, Matt, for a minute and ask you, what is probably the one gap or opportunity where a competitive chain can come up and sort of compete with Solana? What could that be?
Well, I mean, I think you're starting to actually see it today where there's always a trade-off between general purpose, so Solana is basically trying to be the most efficient general purpose chain versus something that's very dedicated to one use case. And you could either make it so storage is less expensive than Solana. You could make it so they have certain properties with like an order book that can do all these things. And it's up to me to make it so that you're still exposing enough to the application to still be general purpose, not have anything too ham-fisted, but still give the applications enough tools that you're close enough that you're to these very specifically performant competitors. This includes Web 2, by the way. Like most apps today are just very dedicated to their one use case. So we've always been competing against that. But yes, to give them enough tools that they can be competitive while still gaining all of the stuff I said earlier around network effects and being on a single shared state. Like the same way that we've always been competitive with, NASDAQ, Fidelity, Vanguard, whatever social app, like in terms of our properties. Now we're getting that have some of the other like cryptographic properties too. So like they're still centralized in a lot of ways, but they use cryptography to be pseudonymity. They still tend not to do KYC AML. So they're looking a little bit more like Solana while still having a dedicated app, just like a centralized app, like would. And I think that's probably a little bit more competitive because it overlaps a little bit more with what we're bringing today. But I think that it's always been the case that we need to just have our offering get more and more competitive with that end state anyways. To me, it's just like moving up our timeline a little bit earlier in which we need to allow applications on Solana to be competitive in the ecosystem. So I don't know. I think it's good to have competition. It shows you what things are working or what are not, and how to adjust your own offering. Like Solana still clearly has a lot of advantages today over these other offerings. So how do you like keep those and accentuate those while being competitive in the places that other people are catching up?
No, makes a lot of sense. And I think to a certain extent that's sort of playing out in the market as well. I just feel like the only caveat to that comes to the fact that if it's not backed by the fundamentals and it's only like a semantic difference, then that ends up becoming like, okay, then you really don't have a differentiator. You almost talking yourselves up. And not to like, I'm not naming names or saying like that's what's happening in the market generally, but I know that some people tend to do that. Like,
Of course.
I think that if there's a sort of learning, taking away the Solana ecosystem that you're building on fundamentals. One
Yeah, I
thing
mean,
that
so I think this is actually a huge point that you just made. I think that up until Solana, Solana has succeeded despite the most FUD. Some of it is self-induced, to be clear. I'm not trying to blame any other ecosystem. Some of it is self-induced, or some of it's like adjacent enough or close enough associated with us that there's like immense FUD. Solana emerged out of that because of principles. We and our applications in the ecosystem created apps that people just wanted to use. It's a very fundamental property. We were not just like screaming at people that were, this is like a new narrative, like we're tied with AI, or we're the new source, like a great reserve asset, we're blah, blah, blah. Like it was just fundamentally. And I think most things need to survive that way. I think blockchain just hasn't gotten that way because it's not used to understanding how to attract users outside of the token. But that Solana has done that. Solana has basically attracted people to buy the token despite hating the token just because they want to use the applications on top. And I actually kind of like that. I like that it's from real usage and real fundamentals of that's like the way that these things are ultimately have to work. This whole like hype and like narrative driven thing, like people still talk about it a lot, but that's going to die. It just has to, because the things that actually have fundamental reasons for why people would use them are just going to take on more and more market share.
No, that's a very fair point. I did want to go back to the fundamentals things, because I think a large part, especially of how I also got exposure to Solana in the early days, was Super Team, right? Some of the more local initiatives, so on and so forth. I know you spoke about how, okay, if you're maybe use case or app specific, you might have an edge. I wanted to understand, and because so many chains have tried it, right? And I always say this, like as a marketer, as somebody who's consulting on strategy, so on and so forth. Whenever a founder comes to me or a project comes to me, and like, okay, what do we look at from a localization strategy standpoint? Like, whose playbook should we look at? Who do we look to inspiration from? And it's always Super Team, right? It's always Solana. I wanted to understand if there's a differentiator from the app chain perspective or like use case perspective. From a localization perspective, do you think like what Super Team has been able to do? One, I wanted to understand like what do you feel like they have worked so well? And not just like, hey, let's pump up our numbers. We have X number of community members, like real tangible startups that have come out that are
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
profitable businesses that have come out of it. What has been the secret sauce? Like how have they been so successful at the localization strategy, and not just in like one part of the world, but across the
Yeah.
board?
It's clearly scalable. I think this tends to be not any one thing. Okay. First of all, I'm not the brainchild of Super Team at all. That's, many Cash, Akshay, like many other people, not me. This is me from an observer uh, commenting on this. I will not take no credit for even doing this. This is me post trying to explain it. I think just coming from my startup days, there's a lot of things that need to take place in order for a business to be successful. Like basically anything to like grab attention and be successful off of that attention. So you can kind of think of it as a funnel. You have to give some sort of awareness or whatever, and then stickiness, and then actual productivity and actual like re-engagement, all that stuff. And I think what Solana has done is it has enough pieces in place that help out a super team. So a super team has very clear goals. They're getting, they talk about like their GDP basically, and those are their actual goals is to get companies and getting hackathon winners and getting bounties for bugs or whatever else, like to actually get paid. So it shows like an explicit, we are adding value somewhere, as opposed to like these hokey numbers that you can gain. Like people are paying them, and that's what they're judged on, and that's how they make their money. So it's like, so I think the requirement there is that you have things like a hackathon that people can actually win, that is, get sponsorships from not just Solana Foundation. It's also all the people who want access to those startups, or the infra providers, the VCs, the different members of the ecosystem that want to be involved in this new startup ecosystem, kind of all contribute now. So it's not really like, so that other thing that's a misnomer is like Solana Foundation doesn't, we support these teams, but certainly not the sole support. It's becoming less and less expensive over time, because this whole model where you're increasing your GDP is like self-sustaining by definition, because you are getting money now. And so not just from Solana Foundation, it's from all these other sources oftentimes. So I think it's really just having a lot of those pieces in place to make something successful. Like a startup, you need to places where there's other savvy people around you. So you have to have the ecosystem that is attracting other good builders, because if it's just you, that's way harder. You have to have capital around. You have to have resources to make it less expensive to upstart. I mean, I think the change just properties where it is pretty inexpensive and we have decent tooling. Like I think our DevRel team has done a really great job of lowering the barrier to producing certain type of businesses. So it's really down the entire stack, from being able to draw attention, because obviously very charismatic leaders started it, but I think it's really just kind of like making use and really thinking critically about how do you make that whole funnel actually work and be sustainable longer term.
And just to follow that thread a little bit, like especially from when you talk about developers coming on board. I feel like with everything that's happening with AI, it almost definition of a developer is changing, right?
But yeah.
And it's continuing to going to change. I wanted to know like how are you approaching AI from the perspective of okay, we can serve as the foundational layer of like verifiable AI outputs that are coming in, or building an ecosystem as we've done before, where we can support and promote privacy first AI models or companies and so on and so forth. So taking the same principles that have worked really well in just general crypto and then porting that over into AI.
So the question is basically how are we enabling like this next generation of builder? And so there's a lot of things. I mean, there's like just very nuts and bolts things like making sure that Solana docs and everything is up to date in all the AI models. Like you know how you used to have like SEO is like a big thing. You have to make sure that you have the right keywords and in the right places so that the Google page rank would order your site the highest. There's a similar learnings happening right now. We need to make sure that if somebody searches how do I develop on Solana or how do I do this on Solana, that the most up to date, right version, and all that stuff comes up. So there's like that like base level, just like working with all the different AI models and how they scrape and how they learn and get it there. And then there's you just that's like the baseline. Then you have like a bunch of other tools like how do you show people how to fit Solana into their content engines and and then yeah. So anything around development. And then there's the other side where I actually think there's just a lot of development parts that are just very collaborative between the two. So if you think of AI, you need energy, you need compute, you need data, you need all these things. Depend on Solana is actually serving these very heavily now. Like Grass, I think, has a lot of demand. You have Hive Mapper coming up and getting more data. You have a bunch of compute platforms that are seeing some adoption, and we even get inbound from because it's so expensive to get compute nowadays that people even come inbound to us at Foundation and ask who you might recommend for inference or training infrastructure. So yeah, I think it's just kind of like all of the above. I think AI is starting to become ubiquitous with, like you're saying, with any sort of development process. So again, you start with this kind of the baseline of this new SEO kind of idea, but then you just really expand to all different parts and figure out where you can collaborate. This goes with any technology. AI is like an incredibly powerful one, but we also want to do the same thing with payments and finance and all these other things. So it's like that's like one of the ideas of being a general purpose platform is that we want to be as close to all these tools as possible. Yeah, we're for developers to be able to build on top of it.
Do you also have like, especially from a tooling perspective, because I feel like especially with startups needing support to grow and scale into the product that they're building, given that a lot of the ecosystem around AI startups comes from that tooling perspective, and that's something that Solana has done really well. Because I perceive it to be like, we have pretty much all the pillars in place within the Solana ecosystem, but I wanted to understand like, is there a strategy behind, hey, we need X, Y, and Z type of tooling to make sure that anybody who's coming into the ecosystem has what they need to build whatever they need as fast as possible. Is that like an approach that you guys have, or is just something that happens naturally?
We definitely have people who are very, very laser focused on filling all the gaps and assessing what's next and what is the next tool that people needed to use. Is that what you're asking? Like, yeah, we have a whole DevRel team. Jacob Creech and his whole team are really thinking about the tools. We have other people that are thinking about per industry. If there is something for payments or for institutional use cases and all these things like extensions of multi-sigs that have more granular control over what they are of ability to do within an address. Like there's a bunch of stuff that we help facilitate. And to be clear, at Foundation, we're like mainly facilitators. We build some of the tools, but it's usually reference implementations. All of the professional grade things are collaborations with people in the ecosystem, which is also very scalable. So we might be some sort of like benevolent owner, kind of like a Linux Foundation or Apache Foundation event. That's kind of like our role long term, probably. But yeah, a lot of this is working with our ecosystem to help fill those gaps.
No, makes a lot of sense. I wanted to go back to something that you spoke about a little while back and taking back from the background that you've had. Why do you feel like, from a gaming perspective, why do you feel like Solana's done that really well? Is it, and why I'm asking that is because I feel like a lot of chains have tried it a lot of chains also call themselves gaming chains,
Yeah.
but somehow like tends not to work out, or like sticky games are not built on those chains, but somehow they seem to be built on Solana.
Yeah.
Is it like the same principles of everything that you're applying it to, or is there something culturally different within Solana that allows for games to flourish?
I think we do a really good job of thinking from base principles. My kind of spicy take is a lot of other chains don't even really even have like gaming leaders. They just have, people who are building infrastructure. And if you do like some industry diagram of, okay, this industry makes use of this, 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 and this, and my platform does this, this, we do assets and we do digital things, we do transfer, like you just like marketplaces. You just like do that thing. You can look at that and be like, oh, games can make use of all of the thing my platform makes. Let's just concentrate on games. But what's really happening there is just games use any tool as a tool to have fun, in some ways or the other. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's crucial to the game to have this infrastructure versus that. It really depends on the game. It really depends on so many things. So it's really not the right way of thinking of it. Just because some infrastructure can use everything you do, it doesn't mean that you're now gaming infrastructure. You really have to have something that's helping them go. And Solana is basically helping gamify and have a whole ecosystem of people who like to gamify certain experiences. And so I think that's why it's done so well, and just like generally just being performant and feeling getting out of the way. Because I think one of the problems with like the reason why a AAA, the games that in Solana that have done well have kind of like emerged. They're not necessarily AAA studios that have just like come on as much as other chains have tried that. But what you've seen emerge is games that are just like trying to do this like really fun. They have this like, idea around other types of distribution and stuff. And Solana is just really, really lightweight infrastructure for them to get anyone in the world to kind of participate. So it really is a lot of this is like Solana just like kind of getting out of the way and like letting the product ideas flourish, just like anything else.
And then, because you mentioned that piece as well, Lana launched a phone, right, with a particular strategy and perspective behind it. I remember
Yeah, yeah.
people almost flooding it, thinking it's a gimmick, thinking it's a joke. But you guys have stuck with it, and there's some exciting stuff coming in it. And why I'm asking that question now is because OpenAI also said, like, hey, we also want to explore like how we can do hardware. What is if you had to break down, what's the mobile strategy for Solana for mass adoption to really bake in, especially with everything that's obviously happening with an AI and all of the infrastructure that you've built over the years? How is the synergy of that happening?
Yeah, I want to be clear. The mobile team is part of Solana Labs, which is things have kind of evolved over time. Solana Labs is just a for-profit company organization now. They have mobile is most of what they do, but they also have Bond, GameShift, and the incubator and Solana Ventures. So these are all like for-profit things. They don't make general tools. They don't have anything involved with the core protocol. So to me, from my perspective, at Solana Foundation, they're just another really good team that's building cool stuff. So it's like so I say that because there are other phones in the Solana ecosystem. This one just happens to have like a Solana Labs name on it. Uh, but it is also very like I want to be clear. We are very excited about this particular implementation. It is the Saga was the first one. That one had, with any first iteration, you run into some issues. It was probably a little bit too high cost, and like the way it was structured was like a little heavy, and maybe not as full featured for how expensive it was. All that stuff. The next version is like a much lower cost, but still has all the features that you want. So we think it's like a much better sweet spot. Get what we want, which is to answer your question. People just use mobile. That is the most common interface in the world to use the internet and I think if you're trying to make just self-sovereign ways of interacting with digital things, digital assets and digital value and value transfer, meet people where they are. It's really that simple. Like I think especially with like there's a lot of places that basically run their finance through mobile now. They get paid, they pay, they do all their commerce through mobile. So having a really secure way to do that and with blockchain centric features, because a lot of these people obviously live in places where their financial system isn't necessarily perfect, or they do a lot of business internationally. There's a lot of people who work with, as dev shops or other, remote based businesses. Most businesses are kind of going global. So, yeah, just meeting people where they are, being on mobile, just is kind of the main goal.
I think, especially from a software perspective and just having things to do on mobile. is something you guys have done really well. Whether that's, I mean, I could go off and naming the different names, but I think that piece definitely is something that has been almost like a moat for Solana as well. I wanted to understand, just to continue that thread a little bit, when you're looking at drawing in more Web2 talent, if let's say they don't fundamentally understand, maybe let's say like why is it that I need to build on Solana? And like why, from my general life perspective, okay, maybe I understand the principles, but maybe I don't care that much about it. But somehow, and this is a problem that every chain has, right? But somehow it is that shift that has happened, especially from, and I looked at some numbers, the migration of Web 2 to Web 3, in terms of like if you compare it with different chains, has been higher for Solana. Is that a communication thing? Is that an infra thing? Is that like, okay, they understand the fundamentals, maybe just the same things that we've spoken about already? Or is it something that they naturally, there's some comfort level that they have with it? What's that magic moment that has allowed for that migration to happen very heavily within Solana and not maybe so much for other ecosystems?
I think it's similar to some of my other answers where it's a lot of pieces coming in together. So there's actually a self-selection bias that happens sometimes when the infrastructure itself is more performant and therefore more like a Web2 experience. Because there's all this FUD about the finality of Solana being 12 seconds, but in practice, single block confirmation is never been rolled back in the history of Solana. So you have high confidence that um, you know 400-ish milliseconds. If you get a confirmation, you're good. Like you actually look at applications, like there's a application called validator.app that will even track like the median full transaction latency, and it's often like 500 milliseconds, and even like the P90, so like the near the worst case, will be under a second often. And so that's like basically 90% of transactions are seeing this like very, very fast finality. I mean, over time, if you just like keep on delivering to your applications, users get more and more confident that this is just feels normal and like natural, and this is just what my experience is, and they just have a great experience. And then because that exists, that attracts the devs who are going to make use of it. And that goes on, the wallet providers and the RPCs and the applications. Like you just have all these different levels in which people are attacking that problem. Now, this also kind of touches on why some of these things can be easier if you're just making like an app, like a full vertical stack, like an application chain or something. It can feel like one can just light a fire and just kind of come out and just name all these properties that sound really great because they can just make them all cohesive. They can run their single sequencer or their like co-located whatever and serve the RPC themselves, which is optimized for their exact syscalls and their exact operations that they do. So it is a little bit different when you're like Solana, where you have to have all these independent parts kind of collaborate. But then that's basically what we've always been at a battle is can you make this? Decentralization doesn't mean disorganization. So you can have this really cohesive experience that you make out of all these independent entities really specializing in their part. This better than decentralization. The thing I think is most interesting is, can that be better than these single team integrations? And I think you're already seeing that the answer is yes. The answer is yes, that can be better. It may not be better at all times in every single possible avenue, but then it's just on us. Like we are very competitive, if you can't tell. Like we really want to just serve our applications and thus the users as much, like all these different types of applications and be the underlying infrastructure for like this new internet capital markets. Like, so yeah, it really is this kind of culture and then piecing all of these different pieces together that are optimizing for their parts of the stack that I think is what makes it so competitive and make it feel so Web 2, even though it's very much not. Any application runs through the core protocol, RPCs, wallets, and their own app, like at least four pieces that of infrastructure that nobody touches. So that no one owns multiple pieces of. So it's at least four, oftentimes way more, because oftentimes you're CPIing into other people's programs or other people's liquidity and all these things. So sometimes it's like, many multiples of that. So it's really interesting to see.
And that's why, like, ICP, sorry, Internet Capital Markets also came up as a concept in its
Yep.
own. So I wanted to understand from a fundamental perspective, not like sort of just ask your direct opinion on it. But Matt, the final question I have for you is, if you could bring one sci-fi technology whatever it is, from whatever movies that you watch or shows that you
Man.
watch, what would that be?
Well, it's not going to need to be. So I actually had this image the other day as we were discussing some economic thing of, Star Trek where Jean-Luc Picard goes, Earl Grey, hot. And it's like every episode, he just like grabs the Earl Grey tea, and sometimes they'd pay with like credits. And so like my this vision of like Solana just being like eventually we're just the credits. All of like finance just kind of like runs through this like ubiquitous um, financial thing that nobody really cares about. They're just kind of like paying in and out, and everything is just kind of settling. Like Solana is like kind of turning into that rail, which was kind of cool. But I'll be clear, that's not the thing that I would want. Like I'd take anything from that world. It's just a teleporter. That would be so dope. And just being able to like go anywhere in the world and then just rehypothecate and instantly. That I mean, pretty instantly. That's great. I think that would be like an amazing technology. I don't know how much energy it takes. I'm not sure if our current uh, systems we need a lot more nuclear power, I believe. But I think that would be the tech that I think would be the most fun.
That's really cool. And I couldn't disagree with it. Matt, thank you so much for doing this. This was insightful. And I also almost feel like there are different elements of the Solana ecosystem that people have tried to break down, tried to understand. I wanted to sort of make this almost like compilation of the best things that have been executed on, and then what founders can learn from it, maybe be inspired by it, and come and build in the Solana ecosystem.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for doing this.
yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for everyone who tuned in. See you in the next episode. Jam and bye bye.